We're going to just wait just a few minutes. Well, I know there's been a lot of people who signed up today, so I want to make sure everyone can join before we get going. All right. So while we still have some people joining, let me get started with introducing some housekeeping before I introduce tonight's speaker. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society's virtual author series. Tonight, we are so honored to have Dr. Georgia Ide, author of Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind, a powerful plan to improve mood, overcome anxiety, and protect memory for a lifetime of optimal mental health. Before I get started, I want to just please remind everyone to check out all of our exciting upcoming programs at hudsonlibrary.org. We have so much coming up, and we'd love to have you both virtually or in person. You can purchase copies of Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind through our local independent bookstore, The Learned Owl, and I'll be including that link below in the chat in just a few moments. At any point during tonight's event, you can feel free to ask a question. We're going to get to as many as we can tonight. So please leave your questions in the Q&A section. Now that that's all taken care of, let me introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Georgia Ide is a Harvard-trained psychologist specializing in nutrition science, brain metabolism, and mental health. She has 2 decades of clinical experience, including many years at Smith College and Harvard University Health Services, where she was the first to offer nutrition-based approaches as an alternative to psychiatric medications. Dr. Ide speaks internationally about dietary approaches to psychiatric disorders, nutrition science, and nutrition policy reform. She teaches a CME course in ketogenic diet for mental health and writes about food and brain for Psychology Today, dietdoctor.com, and her own website, diagnosisdiet.com. Her latest book, Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind, was published at the end of January. Welcome, Dr. Ide, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and thank you to the Hudson Library and Historical Society for inviting me. One of my favorite things in the world is to do Q&A sessions with people, and I'm really looking forward to everybody's questions. And I'm so excited to see that there was so much interest in this topic of nutrition and mental health. We had a lot of people signed up, so welcome, everybody. The reason why I'm so glad that you all share this interest that I have in nutrition and mental health is because, as I'm sure you know, we have a nutrition crisis in this country, and we also have a mental health crisis on our hands in this country, and the two are very much related to each other. Which that's the goal of this book, is to convince you of that relationship and to give you hope that you have a lot more control over your mental health than you realize through dietary changes. In order to get those changes, in order to be able to obtain those changes, to realize those changes, you need to know which dietary changes are most worth making and why. So we are in a bit of trouble here, mental health wise. 1 in 4 of all adults have a mental health disorder, a diagnosable mental health disorder, meaning a condition that's serious enough, of whatever type, to interfere with ability to function. And then among our youngest adults, ages 18 to 25, the prevalence has risen to 1 in 3. So what that means really is that none of us is untouched by this epidemic of poor mental health. So if you yourself aren't living with poor mental health, then someone very close to you certainly is. So the question is, why? Why is this happening? Surely our brains didn't evolve to malfunction on such a grand scale. It feels as if something could be actively destroying it from the inside out. And there's actually good reason to believe that that is what's happening, and that the deterioration in the quality of our diet is largely responsible for the deterioration in our mental health. Now, if that's the case, it sounds very dire, but I actually think it's very, very hopeful, because if you know which dietary changes are worth paying attention to, you can realize benefits very quickly, sometimes within days to weeks. So This is very different from how I was taught, how I was trained back in the 90s and early 2000s. In my training, I was taught that the psychological roots of mental health problems were that the roots of mental health problems were due to what's called the biopsychosocial model of mental illness. So there are biological root causes of mental illness and psychological root causes of mental illness. So some of these, the most prominent theories in the field were really, let me just, so things like, so I was taught that the biological root causes of mental illnesses had to do largely with chemical imbalances, neurotransmitter imbalances in the brain that were rooted in genetic differences between individuals. And I was taught that stress played a large role in the development, that some of us are just more vulnerable, somehow biologically more vulnerable to stress. Trauma can certainly play a role and change a person's chemistry. And of course, your mother. So, I was taught that to treat the biological root causes of mental health conditions with medications. And I was taught to treat the psychological and social root causes of mental illnesses using psychotherapy. So, but what about this modern atrocity? The standard American diet, the so-called SAD diet or standard American diet, more than 60% of the food in our diet is no longer food. Most of what we're eating is ultra-processed ingredients. Now, we're often told that the reason our modern diet is so unhealthy is that it contains too much red meat and too much saturated fat. But we've been eating those ingredients for hundreds of thousands of years. What separates all of the unhealthy diets of today from all of the healthier diets that have come before is that for the past 75 years or so, we've been gradually replacing real whole foods like meat, eggs, fruits, vegetables, and nuts with industrially refined carbohydrates and industrially refined seed oils or so-called vegetable oils. These are the true signature ingredients of ultra-processed foods. And again, over 60% of our diet is made up of these foods. So, and it's not that chemical imbalances don't matter. It's not that neurotransmitters don't matter. Things like dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, glutamate, GABA, these are all names of brain chemicals that are used to send messages in the brain. And I still, even to this day, even though my practice is focused on nutrition and metabolism, I still use psychiatric medications in my work. They do have a place. They can be helpful for some people, but they're not as helpful as we wish they were. And even today in 2024, I have no reliable tests to measure the chemical activity in your brain, and I have no reliable tests to tell you which medication is going to help you best. So even today in 2024, it's a trial and error, sometimes very frustrating trial and error process as I try to find a medicine that's going to be helpful for you. And when you look at this slide, you can see that these medications, even the most powerful medications we have available to us, the antipsychotic medications, they really do still fail the majority of people. They can be very helpful in certain cases, but they don't help most people. And the people that do get some relief from these medications, they pay a price almost always in terms of their metabolic health, their physical health, their quality of life, and so and of course a price at the drugstore as well in terms of copays. So it's it's really in psychiatry for too many years. The biology of psychiatry has been in a standstill. We've really had no brand new types of treatments since the 1950s. So I really have come to understand from studying nutrition for the past 15 years and practicing in this new way that yes, medications can change brain chemistry, but the most powerful way to change brain chemistry is through food, because that's where brain chemicals come from in the first place. But really the question is, which dietary changes are most worth making and why? So I can understand that a lot of people who have heard about the book, or many of you listening tonight, might think, well, dietary changes, oh, maybe they might help a little bit, but they're not going to be helpful in serious situations. How helpful could they really be? You know, people who are, taking multiple medications and have struggled for many years with a serious mental illness. And I really think the reason why we have so little faith in dietary changes is because we've been given the wrong information about what a brain healthy diet is supposed to look like. So the reason I wrote the book is to set the record straight about that and convince you that there are really powerful interventions available, powerful biochemical metabolic interventions that can, even in some very serious cases of mental illness, be life-changing. So, I mean, really, most of us have been feeding our brains improperly our entire lives. So we don't know how much better we can feel if we start eating properly. So I'm one of a growing number of psychiatrists in a relatively new field called nutritional psychiatry. So people in the field of nutritional psychiatry believe that it's the deterioration in the quality of our diet that is largely driving the deterioration in our mental health. So I do consider myself a nutritional psychiatrist. And so nutritional psychiatry, the field, this modern version of nutritional psychiatry has really only been around for about 10 years or so. The term nutritional psychiatry was coined by a researcher, a clinical psychology researcher by the name of Dr. Felice Jacka at Deakin University in Australia. And most thought leaders, not all, but most thought leaders in the field of modern nutritional psychiatry believe that what we should eat instead of the standard American diet, which basically everybody agrees is unhealthy, is the Mediterranean diet. And there's a very good reason to recommend the Mediterranean diet. There are now several high quality clinical trials, human clinical trials, where if people switched to a Mediterranean diet from the standard American diet, they could see significant improvements in symptoms of clinical depression. So there is clinical trial evidence to support that recommendation. So the Mediterranean diet, it's not always defined exactly the same way, but generally speaking, most definitions would say it's high in whole grains, vegetables, fruits, nuts, legumes, and olive oil, that it's moderate in animal foods, seafood, poultry, eggs, low-fat dairy. It also recommends a moderate intake of red wine, and it's low in sweets, red meat, and processed meats. This is a definition that you'll see fairly often. So now I'm not just a nutritional psychiatrist, I also consider myself a metabolic psychiatrist. Metabolic psychiatry is an even newer field, a newer branch of psychiatry. It's maybe about 5 or 6 years old. And the term metabolic psychiatry was coined by a psychiatrist at Stanford University by the name of Dr. Shabani Sethi. Metabolic psychiatrists are particularly interested in the ketogenic diet. And I'll explain why in a minute. But the reason why, but metabolic psychiatry is really focused on understanding the metabolic root causes of mental health conditions. Those of us who consider ourselves metabolic psychiatrists believe that there's a very strong relationship between your overall metabolic health, meaning your glucose levels, your insulin levels, whether or not you have prediabetes, those sorts of things, your general metabolic health, and your mental health. So that's what we study. That's how we try to help people, is by improving the metabolic quality of their diet. So before we dive in just a little bit deeper, what is a ketogenic diet, in case you're not familiar with a ketogenic diet? Because a lot of people think about a ketogenic diet as a weight loss diet, but it was originally invented, designed back in 1921, over 100 years ago, to stabilize brain chemistry. It was originally designed to help children with seizure disorders before there were reliable seizure medications available. And the diet was very successful at helping children with seizures. And now we have many, many clinical trials over the years, more than a dozen high quality clinical trials showing that the ketogenic diet is effective at reducing seizure activity by more than 50% in more than 50% of people, and even stopping seizures completely in more than 10% of people. So it's very effective at stabilizing brain chemistry. So it stands to reason then that a diet that's so good for epilepsy might also be good for other types of brain conditions, especially those that involve unstable brain chemistry, such as, illnesses such as bipolar disorder. So a ketogenic diet is any way of eating that lowers insulin levels enough to turn on fat burning and generate meaningful levels of ketones in the blood. It's generally speaking, it's a very low carbohydrate diet that's moderate in protein, not high in protein, and most of the calories in this diet come from fat. So if you're wondering how both the Mediterranean diet and the ketogenic diet can be good for the brain, good for mental health, how come two diets that are so different? The Mediterranean diet, it's 40 to 60% carbohydrate. It's based on starchy grains and legumes and pastas and breads and cereals. That's a very different diet than the ketogenic diet, where most of the calories come from fat. And so how can both of these diets be good for the brain? So now I think both diets are good for the brain. When you compare them to the standard American diet, just about any diet is better than the standard American diet. So they both have their advantages. But there are many diets we could compare to the standard American diet, and that diet would win. Just about any diet is healthier. So how do we know which diet is best for the brain? So now, just because the Mediterranean diet is superior to the standard American diet doesn't necessarily mean it's the best diet for the brain. So whatever diet you're thinking about, whatever your dietary preferences are, low fat, low calorie, vegan, vegetarian, uh, keto, paleo, carnivore, whatever it is, what we really need to do to understand how brain healthy it is we need to know, what does a brain healthy diet need to accomplish? So one thing I do in the book is I define what a brain healthy diet needs to do. And then you can take whatever diet you're eating and compare it to those criteria. So a brain healthy diet must nourish the brain. It must include adequate amounts of all essential nutrients. I think that's not controversial. It needs to protect the brain from damaging forces like inflammation and oxidative stress, which we'll come back to. So it needs to exclude ingredients that damage the brain. And it needs to energize the brain reliably, safely over the lifespan to support healthy brain metabolism, which is really just how the brain makes energy. So whatever diet you're eating, it needs to meet all three of these criteria to be brain healthy. So how best do we nourish the brain? If you're eating a whole foods diet without any supplements or any fortified foods, it is biologically impossible to meet your brain's requirements for essential nutrients without including at least some animal foods in the diet. So we think of plants as the best sources of vitamins and minerals, but the truth is that we can't meet our requirements without some animal foods. And this is because there are certain essential nutrients that don't exist in plant foods at all, such as vitamin B12, vitamin K2, the omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA. And furthermore, some of the nutrients that plants do contain come in the wrong form. So they're harder for us to absorb or utilize. And these include nutrients like iron, vitamin A, and vitamin D. So, and I know that plant-based diets are very popular right now, and they do have their advantages, which we can talk about. But there really has so far never been a study showing that simply removing animal foods from the human diet without making other changes to your diet, like getting rid of the junky processed foods, simply removing animal foods from the diet has not yet been shown to improve human health in any way because the studies haven't been designed to ask that question. And that's why I recommend that if you're using whole foods and not supplementing, to include animal foods in your diet, or else supplement very, very carefully. And I know this will bring up a lot of questions about, well, what about this and that health issue that we have heard is related to meat. I've devoted an entire chapter of the book to dispelling these myths about meat and showing you what the science actually tells us. So, but please feel free to ask me questions tonight about that. There are also myths about grains and legumes that we rarely hear about. Grains and legumes, they're relatively new to the human diet from an evolutionary perspective. There's no evidence that they're essential or beneficial in the human diet. They're high in naturally occurring defensive toxins, which meat, seafood, and poultry don't contain. They're low, they're fairly nutritionally poor to the extent that when you're making cereals and products and flours out of these foods, you tend to need to fortify them in order to make them look nutritious. They really don't have a lot of nutrients on their own, and they're high in anti-nutrients. So if you're trying to, just because a plant food contains a nutrient doesn't necessarily mean we can access it. And this is something very few people are aware of. So, and just one example of this, because there are many anti-nutrients in plants, but in the grains and beans, for example, one of the most common, most prominent is phytic acid. So phytic acid is a mineral magnet that makes it very difficult for us to absorb the minerals that are in not just in the grains and beans themselves, but also in the foods that we eat along with those grains and beans. And so this is a slide that I use in a lot of my presentations. So forgive me if you've already seen this, but it's a good example. So oysters are very rich in zinc, and which is an important brain mineral. In fact, there is no food that is higher in zinc in the world. So when you eat oysters, this is what will happen to your zinc level. It will rise very nicely in the blood, indicating that you have absorbed the zinc from those oysters into your bloodstream. If you eat that same amount of oysters with black beans, you absorb less than half of the zinc from the oysters. And if you eat the same amount of oysters with corn tortillas, you absorb virtually none of the zinc from those oysters. So this phytic acid anti-nutrient effect, this anti-mineral effect is not subtle. It can have a profound effect on your ability to access minerals that the brain needs. And it's not just zinc. It's also iron, magnesium, and calcium that are affected by phytic acid. And this on the slide is just a list of some of the things that your brain needs these minerals for. Iron is another fantastic example. We take it for granted that 20% of women around the world are iron deficient. That really doesn't make any biological sense. We shouldn't be designed to become naturally iron deficient. And what I like to say is that, we think of iron deficiency as a blood problem. You have iron deficiency, then you have anemia. But if you have iron deficiency, you don't just have a blood problem, you also have a brain problem, because the brain can't make energy efficiently without iron, and it can't make certain neurotransmitters without iron either. So these minerals are really critical to brain function, not just the function of the rest of the body. So how best to protect your brain? So we've talked about nourishing your brain. To nourish your brain, I think it's really important. What I recommend in the book, these are suggestions that you can, I've written the book to give you the information that you need to make your own choices. So I really like to say I'm nutritionally pro-choice. I will help anybody who comes to me to make whatever diet they prefer to eat healthier for their brain, to help them optimize it for better brain health. I just want people to have the right information so that they can make the choices based on what they think is most important to them. So including some animal foods is ideal if you're comfortable doing that. If not, supplement very carefully. And I also recommend minimizing or avoiding, if you can, the grains and legumes. And I've made some recommendations in the book to people who prefer vegetarian and vegan diets about how to make their diets brain healthier. So now, just creating your diet out of whole foods and making sure you're including some animal foods, now you've built this beautiful glowing brain with all the right ingredients. How are you going to protect it from damage? If you, let's say during the week, you follow your brain healthy plan and you're doing all those things that we just talked about, but then on the weekend you indulge in, maybe some ice cream or some cookies or pizza or chips or some ultra processed food that's rich in refined carbohydrates and vegetable oils, what you've done is you've taken that beautiful, healthy brain and you've dropped it into a very unhealthy environment of inflammation, oxidative stress, and insulin resistance. These are the more newly discovered biological root causes of mental health conditions. You will see signs of inflammation, oxidative stress, and insulin resistance in just about all chronic diseases, including chronic diseases of the brain. So these are very, very important destructive forces. And this is why you're always hearing that, we should eat lots of colorful superfoods and fruits and vegetables that have special anti-inflammatory properties. You'll hear that you should eat fruits and vegetables that are rich in antioxidants to fight oxidative stress. Um, what you may hear less about is insulin resistance. So we will talk a little bit more about that. But these root causes, inflammation, oxidative stress, and insulin resistance, these are root causes, but in order to really understand and be able to start taking aim at these root causes through dietary changes, we need to know what causes these. So what causes all of this inflammation? What's causing all of this oxidative stress? What's causing all this insulin resistance? And when you look at the modern diet, lo and behold, you will find there's very, very strong evidence to support that ingredients of the modern diet are directly, powerfully promoting all three of these root causes of mental health disturbances. So what are these just briefly? Um, Inflammation and oxidative stress go hand in hand. They're usually occurring together. So let's say that one way that refined carbohydrates, let's say that your diet, if your diet is like most people's diet around the world now, it probably contains a decent amount of refined carbohydrate in every meal and every snack. So refined carbohydrate are things like sugars, flours, cereals, fruit juices, and refined grains, things like white rice and instant oatmeal. So these not whole fruits and vegetables. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about these refined powders and crystals and syrups, and sugars. So the way that they can cause inflammation and oxidative stress is that every time you have something that is high in refined carbohydrates, you get a blood sugar spike, and then you also get a brain sugar spike. And when you get that excess brain sugar literally sticks, that glucose, that excess glucose from your blood sugar literally sticks to important molecules inside the brain, proteins and lipids and DNA and just about everything it will stick to. And it cripples those important components of your brain cells by kind of caramelizing them and gumming them up. And it turns them into these caramelized clusters called advanced glycation end products. And these advanced glycation end products, they set off an immune reaction in the brain. So brain cells will start to release these SOS signals, inflammatory cytokines, and oxygen-free radicals to deliberately create inflammation and oxidative stress. And that's perfectly normal and healthy, part of your immune system. But if you're eating these refined carbohydrates 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day, instead of this healthy, normal, temporary, controlled, targeted inflammation and oxidative stress that's trying to clear away those advanced glycation end products, you're going to get chronic, all day long and well into the night inflammation and oxidative stress, which is very damaging for the brain. And vegetable oils also can contribute to oxidative stress in the brain. These are brand new ingredients over the past 100 years. There is a fatty acid inside vegetable oils called linoleic acid, and we're only supposed to see a small amount of this in a whole foods diet, but in a processed foods diet, you'll see vegetable oils everywhere. Baked goods, chips, prepared foods, everywhere. So, and even oat milk and things like that. we're eating 3 to 6 times more of these than we ever did before. And the content in our body fat is slowly rising. We're becoming more and more, a larger percentage of us, of our body fat's becoming made of linoleic acid. So these create a lot of oxidative stress in the brain as well. And oxidative stress and inflammation can throw off your neurotransmitters. So there's a more detailed explanation of this in the book, but I just want you to know, to tell you that if you're eating too many of these processed foods, you can see tremendous imbalances in the neurotransmitters that the psychiatric medications are trying to help you rebalance. So, and one of the neurotransmitters that becomes very, very overstimulated under oxidative stress and inflammation is called glutamate. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. It's kind of an emergency neurotransmitter. And so when the levels are very high, you'll get a lot of inflammation in the brain. You'll trigger that inflammatory pathway. And if you've got too much glutamate released from your brain cells, you can run into a situation called glutamate excitotoxicity, which is directly physically damaging to all brain components. So, and again, there's more information about this in the book, but I want you just to make that connection between the foods you eat, your brain chemistry, your chemical imbalances, and then these damaging forces that can take their toll on your brain over time, damaging your brain's infrastructure. How best to energize the brain? Really, you really want to be able to understand what is it that's sapping our brain's energy supply over time. The key challenge here really is insulin resistance. So insulin resistance is, we mentioned this before, has become a global pandemic. That at least in the United States, more than half of us now have insulin resistance. And insulin resistance, all this means, and there's lots more information about this in the book, but you may have also heard this phenomenon of insulin resistance called prediabetes, because very slowly over time, insulin resistance or prediabetes can progress to type 2 diabetes. But that process can take up to 20 years to manifest. Meanwhile, silently in the background, what's going on is insulin resistance is becoming worse and worse and worse. And most doctors are not testing for this. Most people don't know they have it. But most people actually do have it and aren't aware of it. And so, and I'll tell you at the end how you can, a simple test you can do to figure this out for yourself. But this is a very, very important problem, because the problem with insulin resistance for the brain is that it makes glucose, blood sugar, will still waltz into the brain, no questions asked. Here you see a blood vessel over on the left-hand side of your screen. Crossing the blood-brain barrier, the glucose is entering the brain to nourish the cells. Glucose still waltzes into your brain, no questions asked, even if you have severe insulin resistance, even if you have type 2 diabetes. The problem is, what's going to become more and more difficult if you have insulin resistance is that it's going to become harder for insulin to cross into the brain. The brain becomes more and more insulin resistant. And the reason why that's a problem is because the brain can't turn glucose into energy or use it for anything else properly to its full capacity without adequate insulin. So if you have this is kind of a paradox. Over time, the higher your blood sugar, the higher your brain sugar will be, because the glucose passes through the brain and it's always proportional to your blood glucose. But over time, the higher your insulin levels are, the lower your brain insulin levels will be, because you'll become more and more insulin resistant the higher your blood insulin levels tend to run. What tends to push insulin levels up the most? Refined carbohydrates. So what you can see in a situation of insulin resistance, which now, again, the majority of us now have, even young people are developing insulin resistance now, children even now can have insulin resistance, is that when you have insulin resistance, your brain can be swimming in a sea of glucose and still be slowly starving to death over many, many years. That's called cerebral glucose hypometabolism, or sluggish brain glucose processing. So in the interest of time, I know I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for questions. So I just want to mention there's very good science behind this now. The field of metabolic psychiatry is really exploding with research. We now understand that insulin resistance and sluggish brain glucose processing often go hand in hand with common psychiatric disorders and even very severe and serious mental illnesses. So, and it would stand to reason, right, that if the brain isn't able to access enough energy, that all kinds of things can and will go wrong. So, uh, insulin resistance is a very common problem. Most of us already have some degree of insulin resistance. You can prevent insulin resistance by leading a lower insulin lifestyle, which starts by avoiding refined carbohydrates as much as you possibly can. But if you already have a mental health condition, which again, 1 in 4 of us older adults do, and 1 in 3 younger adults do, um, there's good news there too, because you can very quickly lower your insulin levels and take pressure off your insulin signaling system by making dietary changes. So let's come back to this question of how to best nourish, protect, and energize the brain. I've got lots of recommendations in the book for you to think about and consider and try. But essentially, to nourish the brain, you either need to include some animal foods in your diet, doesn't have to be red meat, include some animal foods in the diet, and avoid as much as you can the grains and legumes. Protect the brain by avoiding refined carbohydrates, vegetable oils, and ultra-processed foods. And to energize the brain, avoid refined carbohydrates, which put a lot of pressure on your insulin signaling system and make your brain more insulin resistant and therefore less able to produce energy. But tailor your whole food sources of carbohydrates to your personal metabolic tolerance. What this means, and I spent a lot of time on this in the book because everybody's different. For some people, if you've got a reasonably healthy metabolism, all you might need to do is take all of the refined carbohydrates out and eat whole foods like fruits and vegetables. But for many of us who now have insulin resistance, that's not going to go far enough. And you may, if you have enough metabolic damage, you may need to go further. You may need to lower your carbohydrate intake or even eat a ketogenic diet. So why do I think that a Mediterranean diet may not be your best bet? If this is where you're willing to start, please do. A Mediterranean diet is a really much better diet for you than the standard American diet. So please at least start here. But if it doesn't help you enough, or if you want to go further, what you need to know about the Mediterranean diet is that it is based on nutrient-poor grains and legumes that are high in anti-nutrients. So you could do a better job nourishing your brain. It doesn't protect your brain as well as it could because, yes, it does discourage some refined carbohydrates like sweets, but it also encourages other forms of refined carbohydrate like flour. So biologically, that's sending a mixed message. And I really think the biggest blind spot with the Mediterranean diet is that it pays far too little attention to metabolic health, meaning that it's far too high in carbohydrate, starches in particular, for most of us who now have insulin resistance. Those of us with insulin resistance are going to have a lot more trouble handling a high carbohydrate diet. So I recommend in the book that people, if that we rethink what the kind of basic human diet should look like, and we have to go back even before agriculture to a so-called paleo diet, which is more nourishing, better at protecting, and better at energizing the brain. But see, this energize has a question mark next to it, right? Because it depends on your metabolism. A paleo diet is rich in fruits and vegetables, places no limit on your carbohydrate intake. So for some of you who have insulin resistance, you may need to go further and cut back on even the whole food sources of carbohydrates. And that's where a ketogenic diet can really make a big difference. If you're eating a carbohydrate-based diet, your insulin levels will be high, but your insulin levels inside the brain will be low. And so your brain metabolism will be sluggish if you have insulin resistance. If you switch to a ketogenic diet, your insulin levels will come down, your ketone levels will rise, and those ketone levels will cross into the brain easily and bridge that energy gap that's been created by years of insulin resistance, where your brain has lost some of its ability to process glucose to full capacity. So a hopeful study I'll share with you. We're almost done here, I promise. About a year and a half ago, I helped publish the work of my friend and colleague, Dr. Albert Denat, who invited 31 of his most treatment-resistant patients with serious chronic mental illnesses, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression. These were patients who were taking an average of 5 psychiatric medications, and they had been in treatment for an average of 10 years, some for as long as 30 years. And he invited them to come into the hospital and try a ketogenic diet under his supervision. All of them who stayed on the diet for more than 2 weeks, which was 28 patients, all of them who stayed on the diet improved, every single one of them. And 43% of them achieved clinical remission from their psychiatric condition. And 64% of them left the hospital on less psychiatric medications. So this is just to say that the ketogenic diet is worth considering, no matter what the diagnosis is, no matter how long you've been ill, no matter how many medications you've tried. I really think this is a tremendously hopeful study. We need more rigorous trials and they're all underway, to really show what this diet is capable of. But I think there's an awful lot of hope here. So that's what the book is about. It's really about hope for people with who want to prevent mental health conditions such as Alzheimer's disease, and who want to treat existing mental health problems in a brand new way. So this is what the table of contents looks like. We talk a lot about how we got to understand the wrong information about nutrition. How processed foods damage the brain. What whole foods are actually the most nourishing and most worth including in your diet, and which ones are best avoided. So all the food groups are there for you to explore and learn more about. And then the part 4 is hope is on the menu, meaning I lay out some dietary strategies for you to consider that you can try to see if they're helpful to you. So I hope that this has been useful, and I'd love to open it up for questions now, if you're still there, Alexandra.
I am. Thank you so much. That was just so informative and fascinating to learn about this evening. We have a ton of questions that came in.
Oh, good.
And so we're going to try to get to as many as possible, and I'm trying to group them in a way that might make sense, but we will see. We're going to start off with, do you have any beginner-friendly suggestions for someone who's new to this, who would like to make a change, but, beginner-friendly tips?
Yes. So in the book, I have these 3 dietary strategies, but even before I get to those, I give a list of simple single changes you can make to your diet. And so, and there's, I don't know, maybe, I can't remember how many there are. I think maybe 10 or so that I recommend that you could consider if you're a one at a time person and you want to make one change. The most impactful change you can make, if you're just going to make one change, is to get the refined carbohydrates out of your diet, the sugar, the flour, the cereals, the fruit juices, and switch to whole foods. Whole foods, a piece of fruit, a slice of squash, those types of, all your carbohydrates should come from whole foods, not from powders, liquids, crystals, or syrups. If you do only that, you will be healthier than almost everybody else around you.
Sounds good. We have a lot of questions of just calling out specific food or food groups.
Sure.
I'm gonna go through and rapid fire ask you some of them. We have
Alrighty.
questions. Actually, we'll start with this one. Ed would like to know, could you define what are refined carbs, and could you give an example?
Great. So, it's the reason why this is such a slippery definition is because the USDA defines it says that the USDA believes that there's such a thing as whole grain flour. There is no such thing as whole grain flour. So, because a whole grain is a truly intact kernel of wheat, and you can't make flour out of kernels of wheat. They won't stick together. So, but the reason why you'll see confusing terms like whole grain flour is because the USDA defines, it says that you can call a product whole grain even if you have pulverized the grain to smithereens and put it back and then put all those pieces back into the product. So it just has to contain the same proportion of endosperm and ectosperm and starch and so forth as the original whole grain. So you can really blast it to smithereens and still call it a whole grain. So that's absolutely ridiculous. So any food, I think grains is where it really becomes, that's really the confusion for people is what's a refined grain versus a whole grain. A whole grain is the whole grain. And a refined grain is as soon as you start cutting that up into smaller pieces or making it into smaller particles, it is refined to some extent.
Sounds good. Thank you for that explanation. We, oh goodness, there's so many questions. Linda would like to know, what about dairy?
So, Linda, there's a chapter about dairy and eggs because those animal foods are different from meat, seafood, and poultry. And so dairy is a very complicated food group. That's why I devoted a whole half of a chapter to it. Dairy has its risks and benefits. It's very nutritious. It doesn't contain all the nutrients you need, but it's very nutritious, but it also has some problematic ingredients that can cause inflammation for some people, can raise insulin levels in people and work against your good metabolic health. It can, for some people, lead to weight loss plateaus or unwanted weight gain, and cravings and increase in appetite. And the reason for all of that is dairy is a growth formula. It's a growth formula designed for baby mammals of a different species. So it's trying to get you to grow. And so we're really designed, to all mammals are designed to start off life drinking milk and then graduate to solid food. We're really not supposed to have dairy for our whole lives. So there are some risks involved in continuing to have dairy products into adulthood.
Thank you. Oh goodness. Is there, we have a bunch of people, I know there's, someone would like to know, there's like two questions. I'm going to combine them for this. What nuts and or seeds can be consumed, if any? And then people want to know your thoughts about peanut butter.
Okay, so there's a whole chapter on grains, beans, nuts, and seeds that kind of walks you through some of the pros and cons, of the different types of grains, beans, nuts, and seeds. And so if we're talking about the nuts and the seeds, um, the issue here really, the main issue with nuts and seeds is lectins and defensive toxins. So peanuts have some of the most aggressive lectins. These are defensive toxins that are designed to protect the embryo that's hiding inside the seed. So all of these seeds are protecting an embryo and they're waiting to sprout. And they contain these naturally occurring defensive chemicals that can be problematic for some of us. So, and peanuts happen to contain some of the more aggressive lectins. And another example is seeds, flax seeds, I call out in the book as something to be aware of. Some of the toxins, flax seeds can be a little bit more toxic than some other seeds because they naturally contain traces of cyanide. So just kind of calling people's attention to all these foods are different and they each deserve their own. When we lump them together, we really do them a disservice because different vegetables are very different from each other, different seeds are different from each other. And so I put as much information in the book as I could to help you make choices that that might be a little healthier for your brain, or and if you have food sensitivities, you might want to experiment with removing some of them to see if you feel better.
I will say the one thing I've been able to find out from doing some research on your book for tonight, is that you really seem to have put so much thought into answering as much questions that people could have while they're reading the book. Like it's very well organized and anticipates questions that are coming up.
Oh, good. I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you. That I do hope that's the case. And because I really wanted not just to tell people what to do. That's definitely not my style. I wanted to help people understand food so that they could make their own choices about what to eat.
Sounds good. Oh, goodness. Oh, we still have a ton of questions coming in, which is fantastic. Thank you so
Love
much.
it. Love it.
Okay. We have a lot of people wanting to know about vegetarians, and how to nourish their brain. And you mentioned that there's a whole chapter or part in the book that discusses this as well.
Yeah, so there's a chapter in the book called The Plant-Based Brain, just talking about the risks and benefits of whole foods plant-based diets, and where some of the science comes from that tells us that these diets are superior. And I really want to get very clear, and I make this very clear in the book. There's a world of difference between a vegan diet and a vegetarian diet when it comes to safety for the brain and nutritious quality. So it is absolutely possible to eat a healthy, brain healthy vegetarian diet. It's trickier to with a vegan diet because there are so many nutrients that are missing because there are just no animal foods in a vegan diet at all. But it can, there are lots of things you can do to make that diet healthier. But regardless of whether you're following a vegetarian or vegan diet, all of us, no matter how many plants or animals we're eating or what balance between the two, take the junk out. So if you're following a plant-based diet, don't forget to put that adjective in front, whole foods plant-based diet. Plant-based diets can be just as junky as any other diet. So pay attention to that whole foods adjective. And that way, so take all the flour and sugar out and all the things that all of us need to take out of our diets. And that will be, I think that's a really important message.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in about the ketogenic diet, and I'm just gonna try to group them here because a lot of them are touching on similar things. So a lot of people would like you to see if you could give like an example of what a day in a ketogenic diet, like breakfast, lunch, dinner. A lot of people are asking like what's a sample thing would look like for that, and what carbs would be the best for that.
Sure. So in the book, in addition to the dietary strategies, there are also meal plans and recipes in the book as well for each of the different diet plans. But let me give you an example. So, for somebody following a whole foods ketogenic diet, so a breakfast might be maybe you'll have some, smoked salmon or some scrambled eggs, maybe a vegetable omelet, with whatever your choice of fat might be, whether it's coconut oil or butter or bacon fat, however you want to make it. So olive oil. So there'll be a source of protein. Usually, I recommend from an animal source like eggs or fish or meat, and then there'll be some vegetables if you tolerate those, and then there'll be a source of fat. So a lot of the meals don't look strange. Let's say for lunch, you might have, a piece of salmon and some vegetables and maybe some olive oil, a salad. It really is just essentially meat, seafood, poultry, vegetables, very low carbohydrate fruits like berries can be included to a certain extent. Low carbohydrate vegetables are things like, broccoli and celery and cucumbers and lettuce. These are the non-starchy vegetables, and then a source of fat, whatever source of fat you prefer. I mean, all meals basically look like that. So they're not strange when you think about it. They're just different from how most people eat.
Thank you so much. I'm trying to Um, I know we have a lot of people wanting to know about intermittent fasting and how does that fit into the health of the brain? And if so, is there best foods to break a fast, etc.?
Yeah, so I do talk about intermittent fasting in the book and the benefits of that. I mean, really, the benefit of intermittent fasting is that since all foods we eat raise insulin levels to some extent, the refined carbohydrates raise insulin levels the most, but all foods, even protein, will raise insulin levels to a certain extent. The only thing that doesn't raise insulin levels really at all is pure fat, but nobody eats pure fat, right? So we're eating mixtures of things. Um, since everything we eat raises insulin to some extent, nothing drops insulin more effectively than not eating at all. So when you stop eating, your insulin levels drop like a stone. And that can be really, really good for you. And I explain, how you can use intermittent fasting in combination with these different dietary strategies to optimize your metabolic health. So I can't remember, was there another question tied into that question?
Sorry, I have the library announcements going off. They just, I was trying to see where it went. I think it was more about, is there best food if you did support it to break the fast? But
Oh, I mean, anything that's on your healthy plan is fine. Yeah.
sounds good. Thank you. All right, so we have time for just a few more. And like I said, I know a lot of people are writing in with just specific foods that they're interested in. And your book does, it seems like it really does take the time to detail a lot of that out. Like I know people want to know about soy milk, sweet potatoes, eggs.
Yes.
Goodness knows how much I'm learning.
Yeah, so there's a half of a chapter on eggs. And in the grains, beans, nuts, and seeds chapter, I talk about the plant-based milks. We talk about those. You had asked about a different food there. Sweet potatoes.
Sweet potato.
Oh yeah, so in the fruits and vegetables chapter, we talk about sweet potatoes and other types of starchy vegetables. So it's all in there. And I did that on purpose because I really find food fascinating. So I just wanted to include as much information about everybody's favorite foods as I could fit.
Awesome. So I encourage you all to check out Dr. Ide's book for especially all your specific food requests because she definitely took the time to try to answer them. Okay, I'm trying to think here what else we could do. What creates the phytic acid in legumes and grains? And can it be reduced by if you prepare it in a certain way?
Yes, and this is in the book as well. So the phytic acid in the grains and legumes is a naturally occurring mineral magnet that the seed is evolved to create, and it's there to hold on to the minerals for the baby plant. So if you're imagining a seed as like sitting in a field and waiting to sprout, could be weeks, months, years before the conditions are right for it to sprout, and it has every nutrient that seedling needs has to be protected inside that seed for as long as it needs to wait, including all the minerals that it's going to need. So that phytic acid is there to hold onto those minerals so it won't be washed away in the soil, so that little creatures can't come up and chew on it and get at the minerals in the seed for the seedling. So that's where it comes from. And yes, you can reduce it. Fermentation and sprouting and boiling, all of those things will reduce phytic acid, and I explain that in the book. And you can also reduce a lot of the lectins as well. For example, with prolonged boiling, you can get rid of the lectins, but you have to be aware of these strategies in order to protect yourself and optimize the nutritional quality of these foods.
Thank you so much. And we have one final question I think would be a nice one to end on. We have a lot of people are talking about how much they're excited to check out your book and how it's going to take them a while to eat down their pantry before they switch over. Um,
Yeah,
but
that's what food banks are for.
we have someone who wanted to know where do you have any like tips or something if someone wanted to find a metabolic psychiatrist in our area, what should they be looking for?
Thank you. So on my website, I have a free directory. So my website is called diagnosisdiet.com,
I'll
or
put it in the chat.
great, or you can just, type my name into Google and it'll come up. Georgia Eid website. But there's a tab on the website called Clinician Directory. And if you click on that tab, you can search it by locate the international directory. And these are practitioners of various backgrounds who use ketogenic diets specifically to treat mental health conditions. So it's not for weight loss or diabetes, it's specifically for mental health. So please use that directory. And if any of you out there are clinicians who want to list yourself in the directory, that's also completely free to do. So I hope that that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Dr. E, for joining us this evening. This has been highly informative and just fascinating to learn
I'm
more about.
I'm so glad it was real. I wish I could have answered more questions, but I'll be holding some live Q&As on social media in the coming weeks after people have had a chance to read the book, and so please feel free to join one of those.
So I put the link to purchase the book in the chat if you'd like to support a local independent bookstore. I know the library has copies, but there's a high demand for them. And I also put the link below to check out Dr. Ides Works website. So if you'd like to learn more. And thank you again for joining us this evening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. And thank you very much, Alexandra, for being such a nice host.
Thank you and have a good night.
Good night.